High up in the backwoods of the Appalachian Mountains, a forgotten region, an 11-year-old boy stands near a cabin that's definitely seen better days. His only friend is a mangy mutt with one torn-up ear. It's been 2 years since his mom left him at a gas station, handed him $20, and promised she'd be right back. Those 2 years have been spent drifting, struggling to survive, and finally finding this abandoned shack tucked away among giant, old pine trees and hidden in the morning fog. The cabin's roof is sagging like it's about to give way any second. Its windows are, like gaping, hungry mouths, wide open to the weather. Still, in the boy's eyes, there's a flicker of something special. It's more than just being tough, it's a vision. His rough hands are holding a rusty hammer he found in the shed. Beside him, the dog is watching, always loyal, having been with him since those first scary days of being all alone. What could a kid who was left behind even hope to build in this huge wilderness with just his own grit and a faithful dog? Could this forgotten place become more than just a place to hide from the rain and snow? Could it maybe even become a real home? The $20 bill was worn smooth around the edges from being unfolded so many times, its creases as deep as canyons. The boy kept it in a small metal box under his sleeping pad, a constant reminder of the last thing his mom gave him. "Wait right here, Jamie. I need to make a call and get some things. 20 minutes tops." She'd pressed the bill into his palm, her fingers staying there a split second longer than they needed to. Something in her eyes didn't quite match her smile. "Get yourself a snack if you want. I'll be right back." That had been 2 years ago. The country gas station had been quiet that fall afternoon, just off the highway, a place where truckers sometimes stopped. The sun had been warm, even though there was a chill in the air. Jamie had waited inside, near the magazines, flipping through outdoor ones, picturing himself as a mountain man like the tough guys in the pictures. An hour went by, then 2. The cashier, a big woman with kind eyes, started looking at him with worry. "Your mama coming back soon, honey?" she'd finally asked. "Yes, ma'am," Jamie had answered, with the absolute belief of an 11-year-old who still thought grown-ups kept their promises. By the time night came, the cashier had called her manager. They talked about calling the cops in hushed voices, thinking he couldn't hear them. Jamie had slipped out the back door when things got busy, the $20 clutched in his hand, his backpack with just a change of clothes and his school lunch. He'd spent that first night behind the dumpsters of a fast food place nearby, curled up to stay warm, jumping at every sound. That's where the dog had found him, a scraggly mutt with one torn ear and ribs sticking out. Through its patchy fur, it had come up slowly, head down, eyes unsure but kind of hopeful. Jamie had offered it a corner of his sandwich, and they became friends right then and there. He'd named the dog Scout that very night, whispering the name into the dog's good ear as they huddled together for warmth. The next days all ran together into a blur of trying to survive. Jamie had been smart enough to stay away from main roads and police cars. He'd learned to wash up in gas station bathrooms. To make his money last, he started shoplifting little things from convenience stores, hating himself for it, but not seeing any other way. He'd overheard 2 truckers at a diner talking about the mountains, about abandoned places where people could disappear if they wanted to. Something had clicked inside him then. Not just hope, but a sense of where to go. The journey had started that day. Town by town, Jamie had made his way toward the faraway blue mountains, Scout trotting right beside him. They'd slept in drainage pipes, abandoned cars, and forgotten sheds. They'd eaten out of dumpsters, from people who gave them food sometimes, and from Scout's surprising knack for catching small animals. The $20 had been spent with agonizing care. On a used jacket when the nights got too cold, a decent knife from a pawn shop, and matches when he couldn't get a fire started. Jamie had kept the empty wallet his mom had given him for his 10th birthday, sometimes opening it at night like he might find something new inside. He'd been careful to make up a story for when he had to talk to adults. "My dad's fishing up ahead," he'd say, or "my mom's waiting in the truck." He'd gotten good at looking like nothing special, just another kid running an errand, nothing to see or remember. The mountains had called to him, getting taller every day, promising something he couldn't quite name. Safety, maybe, or just distance from a world where moms left and didn't come back. Nights had been the toughest. In those quiet, dark hours, doubts snuck in like the cold. Had she meant to come back? Had something happened to her? Should he have waited longer? The questions went around and around like hungry wolves, kept away only by Scout's warmth against his side. She's not coming back. He'd whispered to Scout one night, 6 months into their trip, the first time he'd said it out loud. The dog had licked his cheek as tears ran down his face, saying it had changed something in Jamie. The waiting was over. The future, whatever it might be, had started. They had gone deeper into the mountains after that, following animal trails and streams, led by instinct and Scout's sharp senses. Then, through a break in the pine trees one foggy morning, they'd seen it, the cabin. Weather-gray wood, sagging porch, broken windows and all. A place forgotten by the world. A place where nobody would look for a boy who'd learned the hardest lesson of his young life. Sometimes the only family you can count on is the one you find along the way. The map was rough, but worked. Jamie had started it on the back of a tourist pamphlet that someone had thrown away, adding to it with careful marks from a stubby pencil. A circle for the small waterfall where the drinking water was cleanest, X's marking thorny bushes to stay away from, stars showing places Scout had found rabbit holes. The map had become his lifeline in the strange land. Going deeper into the mountains had tested them both. After deciding to head up, away from towns and people looking for him, Jamie had quickly realized how unprepared he really was. His sneakers, already worn when he was left behind, had gotten holes in them within weeks. He'd wrapped them with strips torn from his extra shirt, planning to look for better shoes in the hunting cabins they sometimes found. Food had been the biggest problem. Jamie's stomach had been cramping with hunger those first weeks. He'd watched Scout closely, learning as the dog sniffed out plants and roots they could eat. By being careful, Jamie had slowly made a list in his head: blackberries in sunny spots, mushrooms to stay away from, nuts worth cracking. "Good boy," Jamie had whispered. One evening, Scout dropped a freshly caught rabbit at his feet. The dog's fur had already started to grow in thicker, so you couldn't see his ribs anymore. Jamie had stared at the rabbit, realizing he had no idea how to cook it. His hands had shaken as he used his knife, following his gut and nature shows he barely remembered. That night, the taste of meat cooked over their little fire had been the best meal of his life. Water had been easier to find, but still risky. After 2 days of stomach cramps from drinking straight from a dirty puddle, Jamie had learned to look for moving water, eventually making a simple filter from layers of sand, charcoal from their fires, and the cleanest cloth he could spare. The weather had been the hardest to predict. Spring thunderstorms rolled through the mountains suddenly. During one really bad storm, they'd huddled under a rock as lightning hit a pine tree nearby. The thunder had been so loud that Scout had pressed against him, shaking. Jamie had covered the dog's good ear and whispered things to make him feel better, even though he didn't really believe them himself. They had seen animals sometimes, but not often. A black bear and her cubs across a meadow had made them go 2 hours out of their way. A rattlesnake's warning had made Jamie freeze on a narrow path. Scout's growl warning him just in time. Each time they saw an animal, he added a new mark to his map, adding to what they knew about the mountains. Sleep got easier as the weeks went by. The sounds of the forest, once scary, became a familiar lullaby. The wind in the pine needles, the owls hooting far away, the rustling of animals at night. Jamie didn't jump awake at every little noise anymore. Scout's warm body against his back, the dog's ears always listening for sounds humans couldn't hear, made him feel safer than any locks or doors ever could. They had fallen into a routine, walking most of the day, stopping to find food or look at places, making camp before it got completely dark. Jamie's legs had gotten stronger, his skin tanned and rough beyond his years. The softness of being a kid had been worn away by having to survive, making him leaner and tougher. The mountains had secrets they showed slowly. A hidden valley full of wildflowers, a circle of stones that might have been a campfire. From long ago, a cliff that turned bright orange in the sunset. Jamie added each discovery to his map, making not just a guide, but a record of how they were getting to know this wild place. It was Scout who had found the animal trail that led them to the top of the hill overlooking the cabin. The dog had run ahead, coming back with happy yelps that Jamie knew meant he'd found something. Following him, Jamie had pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel to find himself on a rock. Below, tucked away in a small clearing surrounded by old pine trees, was the cabin. Even from far away, you could see it was in bad shape. Roof falling apart, windows dark empty squares, chimney missing stones near the top. But it was definitely made by people a building with walls and the promise of someplace to hide. Jamie had stood still, taking it all in after months of always moving, of temporary places and not knowing what would happen next. The cabin was something he'd stopped letting himself think about, a place to stay. The kerosene lamp gave off a warm, flickering light that pushed back the shadows but didn't quite reach the corners of the cabin. Jamie had found it buried under fallen roof beams, its glass chimney still in one piece, somehow. There was a little fuel left in it, a forgotten gift from the people who lived there before. They had gone up to the cabin slowly. Jamie circled it twice, Scout walking quietly behind him before stepping onto the sagging porch. Every board had creaked loudly under his feet. The door had been hanging crooked on one hinge, swinging open when he touched it with a low, sad groan. The inside had been dark, and they couldn't see much until their eyes got used to it. One room, maybe 20 feet across. A stone fireplace took up one wall, its floor covered with stones that had fallen from the chimney. Something that might have been a table lay broken in the middle, its legs spread out like an animal that had fallen. Along one wall, a rough counter was still there, with shelves hanging above it, tilted to one side. A narrow staircase in the corner looked like it. Led to a loft above, but some of the steps were missing. "Hello," Jamie had called without thinking, his voice sounding small in the empty room. Scout had sniffed along the walls, sneezing at the dust. The first hour had been spent clearing a small corner near the fireplace. Jamie had dragged pieces of rotten furniture outside, walking through spider webs and making mice run into hidden holes. Scout had helped, coming back once with a dead mouse in his mouth, looking proud of himself. A small cupboard had some unexpected treasures, a dented pot with only a few holes, a fork with 2 prongs left, a stack of old newspapers from 15 years ago. The most valuable thing had been the lamp, which Jamie had cleaned carefully before lighting it when it got dark. The fireplace, luckily, seemed okay even though the chimney was damaged. Using branches that had fallen around the cabin, Jamie had built a small fire, getting it going with his few matches. Smoke had filled the room at first, then gone up the chimney as the fire started to draw. The warmth had been immediate and welcome, a luxury after months of sleeping by open fires. They'd eaten the last of a rabbit they'd caught 2 days earlier, the meat tough but filling. Scout had curled up nearby, his eyes reflecting the fire, sometimes lifting his head at sounds from the forest. Night in the mountains was different from night in the towns Jamie had been through. No traffic, no streetlights, no people talking. Instead, the forest came alive with its own sounds. An owl called from nearby, answered by another one farther away. Something, maybe a raccoon, scratched at the cabin, then left when it didn't find any food. The wind sounded different in the pine. Trees around their new home, somehow sad and comforting at the same time. The sounds that had once scared Jamie now felt familiar. Still, the cabin creaked and settled in ways that kept him awake. Every new noise, the wood shrinking in the cold night air, the scurrying of animals in the walls, had to be figured out. Scout's reactions helped him. If the dog's ears just twitched, the sound was nothing to worry about. If he stood up, Jamie got ready. Sleep came in short bursts, having walls around them, a roof, even though it was falling apart above their heads. Felt both good and strange after so many nights under the open sky. Jamie had put his thin sleeping bag on the cleanest floorboards he could find, using his backpack as a pillow. Scout settled. Against his side, a warm, living thing in a strange place. In the middle of the night, Jamie had woken up suddenly. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The lamp had gone out, but moonlight came through the broken parts of the roof, making silver patterns on the floor. Scout slept soundly, his paws twitching as he dreamed. Jamie had sat up, looking at what he could see of their cabin in the dim light. Even though it was broken down, obviously abandoned for a long time, something stirred inside him. Not hope exactly. That was still too scary to trust, but possibility. For the first time since watching his mom walk away, Jamie let himself imagine a future that wasn't just about surviving. As the first light of dawn came through the holes in the cabin, it lit up the sleeping boy and dog, curled up in a corner of what might, with time and work, become home. The fishing line felt strange in Jamie's hands, so different from the rough bark and stone he'd gotten used to. He'd found it coiled in the back of a drawer, with 3 rusty hooks and a small metal container that might have held bait. The discovery had excited him, a way to get food if he could learn to use it right. His first tries at the stream nearby had just left him frustrated and with wet feet. The line got tangled. The pole he'd made, a straight branch with the bark peeled off, felt awkward in his hand. He'd watched the shadows of fish dart under the surface, close but out of reach. "We need to be patient," he told Scout, who was waiting on the bank, head tilted like he was curious. Mom used to say, "Good things come to those who wait." The memory had come without him thinking about it, and it stung. He pushed it away, focusing on the water, flowing over the stones. By the 3rd day, Jamie had caught his first fish, a small trout that was still a big win. He whooped for joy, scaring birds from the trees. That night, they ate well. The next day brought 2 more fish, smaller, but still a welcome addition to their food of plants and Scout's rabbits. The cabin needed constant work. Every morning, there were new problems. A part of the floor too rotten to walk on, a corner where rainwater gathered during storms, holes in the walls that animals could get in through. Jamie fixed each problem with the few tools he had. A rusty hammer he found in what was left of a tool shed, nails he pulled from broken parts and straightened to use again, boards he salvaged and reused. His hands, once soft from school and video games, got calluses. Splinters were so common he barely noticed them. His muscles ached every night, but it felt good, like he'd done something. Water had been their first worry. The stream was a quarter-mile from the cabin, too far to carry enough water every day. After watching how rain ran off the roof, Jamie had made a system using a tarp he found under the porch, stretched at an angle to direct rainwater into the dented pot. During heavy storms, this gave them enough water to last several days. Storing food was another challenge. Without a refrigerator, fish and meat had to be eaten, fast or preserved. By trying and failing, Jamie had learned that smoking meat over a small fire made it last longer. A cool, dry corner of the cabin became their pantry, where he kept nuts and berries he'd gathered, dried mushrooms he'd tested carefully, and the smoked meat. The forest, which he had first seen as something to survive, started to become a provider. Jamie learned which plants could be used as medicine: willow bark chewed for headaches, jewelweed crushed for poison ivy. He discovered which trees had the best kindling, which stones held heat the longest when put around their evening fire. Scout was helpful in ways Jamie hadn't expected. The dog's hearing warned him about animals coming. A deep growl for predators, a different whine for prey. His nose led them to patches of berries hidden in the bushes, to mushrooms Jamie might have missed, and, most importantly, his presence kept Jamie from feeling lonely in the quiet moments. Their days fell into a rhythm. Mornings spent fixing the cabin, afternoons gathering food, evenings for rest and planning. Jamie started marking a stick to keep track of the days, then the weeks. He watched the small changes in the world around him, the way the sunlight moved, the new plants coming up, the way animals acted, and changed their routines to match. At night, by the light of the kerosene lamp or the fire, he sometimes talked out loud, telling Scout about what they'd done that day, or just talking to the empty room. The sound of his own voice had become important, a reminder that he was still human, even though he was becoming more and more connected to the wilderness. "We're doing okay, aren't we?" he asked Scout one evening as they sat on the partly fixed porch, watching the sunset turn the mountains gold. The dog had pressed against his leg, offering warmth and agreement. For the first time in months, Jamie felt something close to happiness. Not just surviving, but starting to live. The rain started softly, tapping against the cabin roof. Jamie had barely noticed at first, busy sorting the berries he'd gathered that day. Scout lay nearby, chewing on a deer bone, the remains of an animal they'd found already dead, a lucky find that had filled their stomachs for days. By nightfall, the soft tapping had become a heavy drumming. Wind blew the rain sideways, finding every crack in the cabin's walls. Jamie had built up the fire, hoping it would keep them warm despite the dampness. Scout shook himself, sending the earthy smell of wet dog into the small space. The first leak appeared just before midnight, a steady drip from a corner of the ceiling that Jamie had thought was okay. He put the dented pot under it, the metallic sound of water hitting metal adding to the storm. A second leak started within the hour, then a third. Jamie scrambled to find containers, his drinking cup, a piece of bark, a cracked bowl he'd found in the cabin. The floor got wet as water spilled. "It's okay," Jamie told Scout, as much to convince himself as the dog. "Just a little water. We've been through worse." The roof fell in near dawn. A section gave way with a splintering sound, sending wood and cold water onto their sleeping area. Scout yelped, darting away just in time. Jamie wasn't so lucky. The water soaked him, carrying with it pieces of insulation and the bugs that lived in the ceiling. Jamie dragged himself and what was left of their bedding to the driest corner of the cabin. The fire had gone out, leaving only cold ashes. Their carefully stored food, the result of days of work, sat in puddles, much of it ruined. Something broke inside him. All the control he'd kept for months fell apart like the ceiling. Jamie knelt in the water, his shoulders shaking as he cried. All the losses, his mother, his home, his life, combined with this new setback. "I can't do this," he whispered. "I'm just a kid. I can't." Scout came closer, nudging Jamie's hand with his wet nose. When he didn't get a response, the dog pressed against the boy's side, a solid presence. Against the storm, Jamie wrapped his arms around Scout's neck, burying his face in the damp fur. The dog stood still, letting him hold on, offering the only comfort he could. They stayed like that, as the storm onto their sleeping place, exactly where Jamie would have been lying if the noise hadn't woken him up moments before. The realization hit him. Had he been asleep in that spot? "You're right," Jamie said, wiping his face. "It could have been worse." The next hours went by in silent, determined action. Jamie waded through the water, saving what he could, throwing away what he couldn't. He pushed the water out through the door, using a piece of wood as a squeegee. The sun came out, sending light through the hole in the roof, showing how bad the damage was but also starting to dry things out. By midday, Jamie stood in the center of the cabin, hands planted firmly on his hips, taking stock of the situation. The gaping hole in the roof demanded immediate attention and covering. Before nightfall, mountain temperatures plummeted rapidly, and his thoroughly soaked clothes and bedding desperately needed warmth to dry. The dwindling food supply required immediate attention too. Salvage what remained. Most critically, the roof needed more than just a simple patch job. It needed genuine structural repair to prevent a recurrence, an undertaking that stretched far beyond his prior attempts. Jamie's gaze drifted to the fishing line, still safely tucked away in his pocket, noting its strength, flexibility, appearance. His mind started racing, figuring out how it could be used to lash branches together to create a makeshift covering until a more permanent solution could be devised. "We need branches," he declared to Scout, who instantly perked up, sensing the newfound energy in Jamie's voice. "Straight ones, and something waterproof too." The dog tilted his head, appearing to ponder the plan. "I know," Jamie continued. "It won't win any beauty contests, but it doesn't have to. It just has to work." For the first time since the roof's collapse, a delicate sense of determination overcame the pervasive despair. Jamie ventured outside, with Scout at his heels, to gather materials. Overhead, The clearing sky seemed like a promising sign, not necessarily of easy times ahead, but rather of possibility. The storm had tested them, almost broken them, but it had ultimately failed. And within that narrow space between breaking and bending, Jamie was beginning to discover something profound within himself: resilience. Scout's urgent and insistent bark echoed through the trees. Jamie paused in his gathering of roofing supplies, tilting his head to pinpoint the source of the sound. During their morning exploration, the dog had wandered farther than usual, drawn by some captivating scent. "Scout!" Jamie called out, dropping the armful of pine boughs he'd gathered. The bark sounded again, not indicating distress, but clearly summoning him. Jamie followed the sound through a dense patch of mountain laurel he had never fully explored. The bushes suddenly gave way to a narrow ravine formed by spring runoff. Scout stood at the edge, tail wagging excitedly, looking down at something below. Carefully sliding down the steep bank, Jamie found himself standing before the rusted remains of an old pickup truck. The vehicle was half buried in layers of fallen leaves and vegetation that had accumulated over decades. Its once blue paint had faded to a ghostly hue. A young tree had sprouted through the truck bed, its trunk emerging where the rear window used to be. "Good boy," Jamie whispered, patting Scout's head. The dog pranced around with satisfaction at his discovery. The truck door protested with a groan when Jamie yanked it open, releasing a musty odor of decay and old upholstery. The interior had seen better days, with seat cushions rotting from moisture and invaded by small creatures. The steering wheel's covering was peeling away in strips. The glove compartment hung open, devoid of anything useful. But the truck bed held promise. Beneath layers of debris lay a weathered toolbox, its red paint still visible in the protected crevices. With trembling hands, Jamie worked it free, setting it on a relatively clear patch of ground. Before attempting to open it, the latch initially resisted, but then gave way with a sudden snap that sent Jamie stumbling backward. Inside, nestled amidst a bed of rust, lay treasures. A hammer with most of its handle intact, an assortment of screwdrivers in varying sizes, a pair of pliers, and, most valuable of all, a small handsaw. Beneath these, wrapped in the remnants of an oilcloth, a box of nails had survived with minimal corrosion. Jamie whooped with joy, startling a flock of jays from a nearby tree. Scout joined in the celebration, racing around boy and toolbox in excited circles. Further exploration of the truck revealed more valuable finds. A tarp had been carefully folded beneath the driver's seat, providing protection from the worst of the elements. Although mildewed in certain spots, it remained largely waterproof, exactly what they needed for temporary roof repair. A metal gas can in the truck bed showed potential as a larger water container. Even the truck's side mirror, still attached and surprisingly intact, would provide a luxury Jamie hadn't experienced in months: the ability to see his own reflection. It took 3 trips to haul everything back to the cabin. The tools alone would have been cause for celebration, but the tarp represented something akin to salvation. Within hours, Jamie had stretched it over the gaping hole in the roof, securing it with a clever combination of salvaged wire, fishing line, and strategically placed weights. That night, a light rain tested his repair efforts. A few drips managed to find their way through, but compared to the previous downpour, the cabin remained blessedly dry. Jamie lay awake, listening to the gentle patter on the tarp, filled with a satisfaction deeper than any heed. Known since discovering the cabin, the discovery changed everything. With the right tools, repairs that would have seemed impossible became merely difficult. Projects that would have taken weeks might now be completed in days. The saw, in particular, opened up new possibilities: the ability to cut boards to precise lengths, to shape wood for specific purposes rather than adapting to whatever nature provided. In the days that followed, Jamie established a makeshift workshop on the cabin's porch. He spent hours getting acquainted with each tool, learning its feel and purpose through trial and error. His hands, already toughened from months of survival, developed new calluses in different places. The satisfaction of driving a nail cleanly, of sawing a straight line, of fixing instead, of just patching. These became new pleasures in a life that had known too few. Scout, sensing the importance of their discovery, guarded the toolbox with particular vigilance. He seemed to understand that these strange metal objects represented security in ways his canine mind might not fully grasp, but certainly respect. 1 week after discovering the truck, Jamie stood in the cabin doorway, surveying their accomplishments. The roof, while not perfect, would hold up against the next storm. The worst sections of the floor had been reinforced or replaced with boards salvaged from less critical areas. A simple shelf now held their meager possessions off the ground. "What do you think, Scout?" he asked, reaching down a scratch behind the dog's good ear. "Starting to look like a real home, isn't it?" Scout leaned into Jamie's hand, his tail sweeping the newly swept floor in what appeared to be enthusiastic agreement. Jamie's gaze drifted towards the hillside where the truck lay hidden. What other treasures might be lurking in these mountains? What other remnants of human presence might help transform their survival into something closer to comfort? For the first time, Jamie allowed himself to think beyond mere existence, beyond the daily grind of meeting basic needs. He permitted himself to imagine improvements, enhancements, even occasional luxuries. Not just shelter, but a home. Not just surviving, but building. The first frost arrived as a whispered warning. Jamie woke to find delicate white patterns etched across the cabin's few-glass window. Panes. The ground outside stiffened and crackled beneath his feet. Scout's breath formed small clouds in the morning air. The mountains had been hinting at the change for weeks, shorter days. Leaves transitioning from green to brilliant reds and golds. Wildlife behaving with a new sense of urgency. Standing on the porch, Jamie watched a V formation of geese fly overhead, their honking calls fading into the distance. His thin jacket, which had been adequate during the summer months, now allowed the chills to seep through. Each breath stung his lungs slightly, a sensation that was both invigorating and concerning. "Winter's coming," he told Scout, who sat alert beside him, ears perked up towards a distant sound that only he could hear. "And we're not ready." The wood stove squatted in the corner of the cabin, a cast-iron behemoth that Jamie had largely ignored during the warmer months. Previous owners had left it behind, likely finding it too heavy to transport down the mountain. Its surface was covered in rust. Its door hung askew, and the stovepipe that should have been connected to the chimney lay in sections on the floor. Gathering frost, Jamie recognized the stove for what it truly was, the difference between survival and perishing in the coming months. The next few days were filled with frantic preparation. Using the tool from the truck, Jamie repaired the stove door, securing it with wire where the hinges had failed. He scraped rust from critical joints, applying rendered animal fat as a makeshift protective coating. The stovepipe sections required careful cleaning and fitting, but eventually formed a continuous path from the stove to the chimney. His first test fire filled the cabin with smoke, sending both boy and dog retreating outside, eyes watering. After adjusting the pipe angle and clearing an obstruction in the chimney, his second attempt proved more successful. Heat radiated from the iron surfaces, quickly warming the cabin's interior. That night, they slept in true comfort for the first time since finding the shelter. Firewood became his obsession. Jamie had maintained a small stockpile for cooking, but winter would demand far more. He established a daily routine. Mornings spent felling dead trees with the saw, afternoons dragging logs back to the cabin, and evenings cutting and stacking the wood in a sheltered area on the porch. His muscles ached constantly, but the growing woodpile provided visible evidence of progress. Food storage presented another significant challenge. The stream would likely freeze, making fishing impossible. Wildlife would become scarcer. Foraging opportunities would diminish dramatically. Jamie revisited his earlier experiments with smoking meat, refining his technique to extend preservation time. He gathered every edible nut and berry that was still available, storing them in containers salvaged from the truck and the cabin debris. The cabin itself needed weatherproofing. Using moss, mud, and strips of cloth, Jamie methodically sealed the gaps between the logs where cold air infiltrated. He repaired the door so that it closed more securely. For windows with broken panes, he stretched oiled paper pages from an old magazine found in the truck to allow light in while blocking the wind. Scout seemed to understand the urgency of their preparations. He ranged farther on his hunting expeditions, bringing back rabbits and, occasionally, larger game that Jamie would never have been able to catch on his own. The dog's coat grew thicker, nature providing insulation that Jamie could only envy. His own clothing was a great source of concern for him. The few garments he possessed had endured months of hard use, growing thin in crucial places. Using a needle and thread from a small sewing kit discovered in the truck's glove compartment, Jamie reinforced what he could. He fashioned crude mittens from a seat cover, the vinyl exterior providing some protection against wind and moisture. The first snow arrived just as the last leaves fell. Jamie watched from the doorway as white flakes drifted down, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful. Scout bounded through the accumulating powder, playfully snapping at the falling flakes, and then returning to shake himself vigorously near the stove. That evening, with a steady fire casting a warm glow throughout the cabin, Jamie performed a mental inventory of their preparations. The woodpile would last 2 months if carefully managed. Their food stores would sustain them for perhaps half that time, requiring supplementation through winter hunting and trapping. The cabin, while far from perfect, would keep out the worst of the elements. Would it be enough? Jamie couldn't know for certain. His knowledge came from books read in Another Life, from trial and error, from desperate necessity. The mountains in winter were unforgiving. He'd heard enough stories before his abandonment to understand that much. As darkness settled, completely outside, Jamie added wood to the stove, adjusting the damper to maintain a slow, efficient burn throughout the night. Scout curled up nearby, already dozing in the radiant heat. The dog's presence had been Jamie's constant comfort throughout all the challenges they'd faced. Now, facing the greatest test yet, that simple companionship seemed more valuable than all their physical preparations combined. Jamie ran his hand along the wood stove's warming surface, feeling the promise of heat contained within its iron walls. The stove wasn't just a tool or an appliance. It represented the heart of their home, the center around which they would orbit through the cold months ahead. "We can do this," he whispered, as much a prayer as an affirmation. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and relentless, blanketing their mountain sanctuary in winter's first embrace. The day started like any other midwinter morning. Before dawn, Jamie stoked the wood stove, the cabin interior still carrying the chill of the long night. Scout stretched languidly near the warmth of the stove, his morning routine unhurried now that snow completely covered their mountain world. 3 months into winter, they had established comfortable routines. Mornings were devoted to essential chores, clearing snow from the path to their outhouse, checking there carefully, set trap lines, and breaking the thick ice on the stream to get fresh water. Afternoons were dedicated to cabin improvements, the kind of projects that the warmer months hadn't allowed time for. Evenings were typically spent in the quiet companionship of a boy and his dog, the firelight dancing on the walls that were now decorated with simple carvings and found objects that made the space uniquely theirs. Jamie had just returned from checking his traps, feeling satisfied to find a rabbit caught in the snare he'd placed closest to the cabin. The morning sun was glinting intensely off the pristine snow, and the air was so clear and cold that it almost hurt to take a deep breath. He paused for a moment on the porch, admiring the stark, white beauty of the landscape, before turning to the task of preparing their meal. It was Scout's sudden alertness that gave Jamie his first warning that something was amiss. The dog stood as rigid as a statue, his ears pricked forward, his dark eyes fixed intently on the tree line to the south of the cabin. A low growl, barely audible, rumbled deep in his throat. It wasn't the aggressive bark and snarl he reserved for predators, but it was a warning nonetheless, a signal that something wasn't right. Jamie followed the dog's focused gaze, and at first, he saw nothing unusual among the snow-laden pines. Then, a subtle movement caught his eye, a dark figure trudging slowly up the narrow path that Jamie had worn through the trees. A human figure, bent nearly double against the biting wind, moving with the deliberate and careful pace of someone who is desperately trying to conserve energy. Panic flared in Jamie's chest, sudden and sharp. In nearly 2 years of complete mountain solitude, they hadn't encountered a single soul. His hand instinctively went to the hunting knife at his belt, his mind racing through the extremely limited options he had in a situation like this. Run and hide, stand his ground, and try to defend the cabin? Before he could decide on any course of action, the figure looked up, spotting him standing on the porch. A gloved hand raised in a tentative greeting. "Hello there," a deep voice called out, the sound carrying with unexpected clarity in the still, frigid air. "Mighty cold day for a hike, ain't it?" The man who emerged from insulated coveralls, a heavy backpack, and a set of snowshoes that explained how he was able to navigate the deep snowdrifts. Nothing about his appearance or demeanor suggested any kind of threat. "I'd offer to take off my glove and shake hands, but I'd likely lose a few fingers to frostbite in this cold." Jamie didn't say a single word, studying the stranger with undisguised suspicion. "Not much for conversation. Can't say I blame you for it." The man, Henry, glanced up at the sky where dark clouds were rapidly gathering on the horizon. "Storms rolling in faster than I was expecting. I've been hiking these mountains for over 30 years, so I should have known better than to put too much faith in the weather forecast." He nodded towards the cabin. "I don't suppose," pressing at his teeth, begging to be voiced. Weather service forecast? These were things, artifacts from a world he had left behind, almost forgotten, reminders that beyond their isolated mountain. Approaching storm began to fall, small but dense, promising rapid and significant accumulation. Scout whined softly, pressing himself tightly against Jamie's leg. "I'm not with any kind of authorities or anything like that, if that's what you're worried about," Henry said quietly. "Just an old man who happens to love these mountains enough to risk getting frostbite just to see them, dressed in their winter finery. Whatever it was that brought you up here, that's your business, not mine." Something in the man's steady and honest gaze, and in the simple respect with which he waited patiently for Jamie to make his decision, eased the hard, tight knot of tension in the boy's chest. After nearly 2 long years of speaking only to Scout, Jamie found that his voice was rusty, with disuse, almost unfamiliar to his own ears. "Storm's coming in quick," he said finally, his voice a rough croak. "You'd better come inside before it hits us." A visible wave of relief washed over Henry's weathered face. "Much obliged to you, son." The cabin immediately felt much smaller, somehow, with the addition of a third presence. Henry carefully removed his bulky outer gear with great respect, hanging it where Jamie indicated with a curt nod, and then placed his snow-covered boots neatly by the door. He was carrying a rather large pack, which he set down gently in the corner, carefully asking Jamie for permission before he even considered removing anything from it. Scout circled the visitor cautiously, sniffing with an intense concentration before finally seeming to come to the conclusion that the old man really didn't pose any particular threat. He then promptly settled down near the warm wood stove, although his dark eyes rarely left the stranger for more than a few moments. "You've done remarkable work here, you know that?" Henry commented quietly, looking around the small cabin with genuine and obvious appreciation. "There aren't too many adults that could manage to do what you've done, let alone." He trailed off, tactfully choosing to avoid any direct reference to Jamie's young age. As the storm intensified outside, a completely unexpected exchange began to take place. Henry very generously shared some of the small luxuries he had packed: real coffee, a bar of dark chocolate, and a small packet of dried fruit. Jamie, not wanting to be outdone, contributed the rabbit he had caught earlier that morning, which they roasted together over the wood stove. Conversation started haltingly at first, but then it flowed with increasing ease, as Jamie's long-dormant social instincts slowly began to reawaken. Before he departed on the storm's second day, Henry left behind an unexpected and deeply treasured gift, an old camera. It wasn't a modern digital model, but an old film camera with several rolls of completely unexposed film. "To document your world up here," Henry explained with a warm smile. "Some things are definitely worth remembering." Jamie held the camera very carefully in his hands, examining this artifact from beyond his isolated mountain sanctuary. Then he watched as Henry disappeared back into the dense trees, his snowshoes leaving very distinctive prints in the fresh snow, prints that would soon be completely covered by the next relentless wave of snow. As he turned back to the cabin, Jamie felt a very curious mixture of relief and a profound sense of loss. Their familiar solitude had resumed, and yet it had somehow been permanently transformed by that brief but meaningful intersection with another human life. The last of the winter snow melted with obvious reluctance, retreating gradually into the deeply shaded hollows where it would stubbornly persist for several weeks despite the steadily warming days. Jamie stood at the very edge of the clearing, inhaling deeply, filling his lungs with the fresh, clean air. The air now carried a whole host of new scents that had been absent for months. The scent of damp earth, of green things stirring beneath the surface, and the unmistakable smell of life reawakening after winter's long and unforgiving constraint. Winter had tested them both severely. Their food supplies had dwindled to almost nothing by the time February finally rolled around. The woodpile, which had seemed so huge and substantial back in November, had required constant and strenuous replenishment. Twice, particularly fierce storms had isolated them completely for days on end, with the howling winds making even the short trip to check their precious traps a dangerous and risky proposition. And yet, despite all the hardships, they had somehow endured. Now, with the lengthening days and the rapidly gentling temperatures, the change of seasons, ranging further and further afield on his daily morning walks, and returning with mud-splattered fur and the distinctively satisfied expression of a dog who had thoroughly investigated and approved of spring's imminent arrival. The mountains were transformed on a daily basis. First, with the sudden appearance of tiny, delicate wildflowers pushing their way determinately through the very last of the melting snow. Then with the almost imperceptible haze of pale green as the bare trees began to bud, and finally with the joyous and triumphant birdsong that now filled the dawn hours. Jamie was in the process of carefully clearing all the accumulated winter debris from around the base of the cabin when he discovered a small packet tucked rather inconspicuously into a narrow crevice beneath the porch steps, completely protected from the dampness by its waterproof wrapping. That small envelope might have easily remained hidden there indefinitely if Jamie hadn't been so extremely thorough in his spring cleaning efforts. Inside the protective wrapping, he found a treasure, a collection of garden seeds. Dozens of small paper packets, each one carefully labeled. In faded handwriting, carrots, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, corn. Some of the packets bore dates from as far back as 5 years earlier. Others were simply unlabeled beyond a simple designation of their contents. The abandoned plans of a previous owner, perhaps, or a forgotten cache of supplies left behind during some long-ago transition. Jamie carefully spread all the packets out on the weathered planks of the porch, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. The seeds represented a future beyond mere survival, a chance to cultivate a connection to the land, a promise of abundance and nourishment in the months to come. Jamie sat at the cabin's rough wooden table, carefully organizing the various seeds by type. The sheer number of possibilities of partnering with the fertile earth to produce his own sustenance stirred something incredibly profound deep within him. The work began immediately, utilizing the precious tools he had recovered. Surprised him with its dark and rich quality. far more fertile than he had initially expected. Years and years of fallen leaves had created a remarkably effective natural compost. He carefully marked, "Operation with a certain degree of moderate interest. These seeds are pretty old, and I don't really know all that much about what I'm doing." The dog simply tilted his head slightly, offering neither agreement nor disagreement with Jamie's rather pessimistic assessment of the situation. Days slowly passed, filled with Jamie checking the garden obsessively, looking for the numerous rabbits and deer that seemed to be showing an unnatural amount of interest in his new gardening project. When the very first green shoots finally appeared, tiny, fragile things pushing their way through the dark soil, Jamie grabbed Henry's camera and took a photograph. He knew that the image would probably be imperfect and definitely amateurish, but he wanted to document this momentous and almost miraculous moment of creation. Throughout the long winter, the camera had remained largely unused, the precious rolls of film far too valuable to waste on mere snowdrifts and firelight. But this moment, the birth of new life from the cold earth, seemed truly worthy of permanence. As spring gradually advanced into early summer, the garden flourished far beyond Jamie's most optimistic expectations. Not everything thrived, of course. The tomato plants struggled valiantly in the surprisingly high mountain elevation, and something lurking beneath the surface of the soil devoured almost half of the potato seedlings. But many of the other plants grew with a hearty vigor that seemed to suggest they had belonged there all along. The very first harvest was almost carefully in the clear stream water, and then shared one with Scout, who accepted the offering politely but without any real enthusiasm. But the taste exploded across Jamie's tongue, a combination of earth and sunshine that was so incredibly different from the wild forage foods and the game that had sustained them for so long. "We grew this, Scout," Jamie said quietly. Other much-needed improvements around the cabin. He reinforced the cabin's north wall, which had shown quite alarming signs of weakness during the previous winter's fierce storms. He also expanded their rainwater collection system, adding a simple but effective filtration method that rendered the collected water even cleaner and safer than their previous somewhat haphazard methods. Most ambitiously of all, he began the arduous task of constructing a root cellar, a small underground space adjacent to the cabin where they would be able to store vegetables throughout the coming winter months. The work was undeniably physically demanding, but it was also deeply and powerfully satisfying. Jamie's young body, already hardened and toughened by months of almost constant physical labor, gradually developed new strength and resilience. His hands, once soft and untried from a life of childhood ease, now told the story of his mountain life through the calluses and small scars that marked each lesson he had learned and each challenge he had managed to overcome. In quiet moments, usually at dusk when the day's work was finally complete, Jamie sometimes found himself thinking about Henry, their unexpected winter visitor. Had the old man somehow known about the hidden seeds? Had he noticed the small packet's careful hiding place beneath the porch steps, but simply chosen to leave it for Jamie to discover on his own? The timing seemed almost too perfect to have been a mere coincidence. And yet, Jamie could never be completely certain. What was certain was the dramatic transformation that was taking place, not just of the land immediately surrounding the cabin, which now showed all the clear signs of careful cultivation rather than mere habitation, but of Jamie himself. He was actively creating rather than simply trying to survive. He was building rather than merely existing. And in that act of creation, he found a profound and undeniable form of healing. The knife had taken Jamie nearly a full week to carefully carve. It was made from a fallen branch of mountain maple, and its handle was smooth from hours of patient sanding with progressively finer grades of stone. The blade section was purely decorative, wood carefully shaped to resemble burnished metal, but the overall craftsmanship clearly showed a remarkable attention to detail. It joined 3 other painstakingly crafted items in his small pack: a pair of carefully sewn rabbit fur mittens, a beautifully carved wooden cup, adorned with intricate pine tree motifs, and a small pouch filled with dried herbs that he had discovered had a pleasantly refreshing, tea-like flavor when steeped in hot water. "What do you think, Scout? Is it all worth the trip?" Jamie asked, carefully adjusting the pack straps across his shoulders to distribute the weight. The dog, immediately sensing the imminent arrival of an expedition, beyond their familiar territory, began to circle excitedly at his feet, his tail wagging furiously. Henry's unexpected winter visit had provided much more than just a brief moment of companionship. And a camera. During their conversations on those long, snowbound evenings, he had mentioned the existence of a small general store located some 7 miles down the mountain. He called it Mason's Trading Post and said it was situated where the Fire Road met the river. Old Everett Mason ran the trading post on the river. He was as crusty as stale bread, but he was known to be fair in his dealings. Jamie had been turning this information over in his mind for months, but hadn't acted on it. The cabin and the land immediately around it had become his safe haven, a familiar world, where he could control almost everything. Going beyond that meant taking a risk. Discovery, questions he couldn't answer, and the authorities who might take away the life he had built. However, there were certain things he desperately needed that he couldn't get on the mountain alone. The most important were salt and matches. His supply of matches was getting dangerously low, even though he was being very careful with them. He also needed fabric to make winter clothes because his current ones were beyond repair. The idea of facing another winter without these things finally pushed him to overcome his hesitation. The trip took up most of the day. Jamie stuck to game trails whenever he could, avoiding the well-worn paths where he might run into hikers. Scout ranged ahead and behind, disappearing into the undergrowth now and then, only to pop back out moments later, silently reassuring him. Mason's trading post suddenly appeared as he rounded a bend. In the Fire Road, it was a weathered old building with a metal roof that had turned rust red over the years. A lone gas pump stood like a guard near the entrance, its analog display looking like something from decades ago. 2 pickup trucks were parked randomly in the gravel lot. Jamie stopped at the edge of the woods, his heart pounding at the sight of people, real people with homes, vehicles, and connections to the outside world. He almost turned back, but his needs forced him forward. With Scout a reassuring presence at his side, he pushed open the door, setting off a jarring jangle from the bell. The inside was dimly lit, and the shelves were packed with a strange mix of things. Fishing gear next to canned goods, work gloves crammed in with candy bars. A potbelly stove sat in one corner, surrounded by 3 chairs. The men sitting there stopped talking and looked at the newcomer. "Help you, boy?" The voice came from behind a counter stacked high, with ammunition boxes. An old man with deep lines on his face studied Jamie with sharp blue eyes. "Just looking," Jamie managed, his voice rough from not using it. "You're welcome to look," the man replied. "Buying's better for business." The old man, who Jamie figured must be Everett Mason, went back to sorting fishing lures, but he kept a close watch on the strange boy and his dog. Jamie walked through the store, trying to stay calm, picking out only the most important things he needed: salt, matches, a small bottle of kerosene, and 3 packets of needles in different sizes. He was tempted by other things: canned peaches, a thick wool blanket, real coffee like Henry used to share, but he didn't have much to trade. At the counter, Jamie carefully set his handcrafted items next to the things he'd chosen. "For trade," he said simply. Mason looked over each piece with his rough hands, pausing at the carved knife. "You make these?" Jamie nodded. "Got skill." The old man put the knife down. "Not enough for all this, though." "What is enough?" Jamie asked, getting ready to put things back on the shelves. "Depends." Mason leaned forward. "You the one living up in the Pritchard cabin?" "Old place, mile or so from Eagle Ridge." Jamie's blood went cold. "Don't know any Pritchards." "No need to spook, boy. Mountain folk mind their own business." Mason glanced at the men by the stove, then back at Jamie. "Been wondering who was smoking that chimney last winter. Figured either squatters or someone with more guts than brains." The store had gone silent. Jamie felt the weight of the unseen eyes of the men near the stove on him. Scout pressed against his leg, sensing his worry. "Good work with these," Mason said, tapping the carved items. "Take your supplies. For more next time. Maybe some of those berry baskets, like the ones sticking out your pack. My summer customers, the tourists, they love that." Handmade stuff. The exchange was done. Jamie quickly put away his purchases and turned to leave. At the door, Mason's voice stopped him. "Boy." The old man's voice had softened a bit. "Mountains get right cold come January. You stop 'em before then. Got some advice might help you through." Outside, Jamie took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling relief wash over him. He'd done it. He'd interacted with the outside world without anything terrible happening. As they started the long walk home, he went over everything he'd seen in the store, thinking about what he could trade for on future trips. Over the next few months, Jamie got into a routine. Every few weeks, if the weather was good, he made the trip to Mason's, trading better and better carvings and crafts for things he needed and sometimes things he just wanted. The old storekeeper never asked him directly about his situation, but he gave him practical advice in short, gruff sentences. Other people who lived in the mountains, scattered in cabins and homesteads miles apart, became familiar faces at the store. Most of them respected his privacy the way Mason did, nodding to Jamie instead of asking questions. A few were happy to share what they knew, which plants could treat a fever, how to tell when a storm was coming by the clouds, and how to keep vegetables from the garden fresh through the winter. In these small interactions, Jamie found a strange balance. Human connection without being bothered, community without having to commit to anything. Each time he went back to the cabin, it felt less like he was running away and more like he was choosing to be there. Scout, who had been wary of strangers at first, slowly started making his own friends, accepting scraps from Masons. Sandwich, putting up with pats from a woman with a leathery face who sold honey, and becoming particularly close to an old hound who went with a trapper on his monthly visits. Their world was growing, slowly but surely beyond the walls of the cabin. The chess set gleamed in the afternoon sunlight that came through the new window. Each piece had been carved with a lot of care from different kinds of wood. Maple for the white pieces, walnut for the dark ones. The king was the tallest, his crown detailed with tiny notches. The knights had flowing manes and alert ears. Even the pawns had their own personalities. No two were exactly alike. Jamie leaned back, looking at his creation with pride. He'd spent 3 months working on it in the evenings, using better and better tools that he'd traded for or bought at Mason's store. The board itself was his greatest achievement, with alternating squares of light and dark wood and edges beveled with a plane he'd borrowed from Cal Erickson, who lived 2 ridges over. "What do you think, Scout?" Jamie put the final piece, the White Queen, in place. The dog raised his head from his usual spot near the wood stove and thumped his tail, briefly before going back to his nap. The chess set was more than just a game. It marked a change from just surviving to creating art, from simply existing to making something beautiful. Jamie ran his fingers over the smooth pieces, remembering playing with his grandfather on Sunday afternoons in another life. He couldn't remember all the rules now, but the point had been making it, not playing it. Standing up, Jamie looked around the cabin with quiet pride. It looked so different from the abandoned wreck they'd found 3 years ago. The roof, which had been partly collapsed, was now solid and weatherproof, properly shingled with materials he'd hauled up the mountain over many trips. The walls, which used to have gaps that let in wind and insects, had been filled in and sealed, then insulated with a mix of clay, straw, and moss that kept the warmth in during the winter and the heat out during the summer. The floor, which was probably his greatest accomplishment, was no longer likely to collapse underfoot. Jamie had systematically replaced the rotted boards with new lumber, some of which he'd bought with his trading proceeds, and some of which he'd painstakingly split by hand from fallen trees. The finished surface, sanded smooth and oiled with a mixture Mason had recommended, glowed with a warm amber color. The windows, which had just been empty frames, now had real glass panes, a luxury he'd been able to afford after months of saving and trading. The door, which he'd rebuilt completely, swung on sturdy hinges and latched securely at night. The furniture, which had once been limited to salvaged items and crude necessities, now showed his growing skill. A table made of split logs, supported by a trestle base, stood in the main room. 3 chairs surrounded it, one perfectly sized for Jamie, one sturdy enough for larger visitors, and one carved with paw prints along its arms as a tribute to Scout. A bed had replaced the floor, pallet he'd used in the early days. Its frame was joined with carefully crafted dovetails, and its mattress was stuffed with dried grasses and pine needles that Jamie replaced each season. Scout's bed, which was nearby, was a smaller version of Jamie's, although the dog often preferred to share Jamie's bed on cold nights. Shelves lined the walls, displaying both practical items and a growing collection of natural treasures. Jamie gathered interesting stones, abandoned birds' nests, and a shed deer antler he'd found during his spring explorations. Books took up an entire section of the shelves, a precious collection he'd acquired through trades and occasional purchases. Some were practical guides to edible plants, basic medicine, and wilderness skills, while others offered pure enjoyment, adventures, and stories for winter evenings. The wood stove remained the heart of the home, but now it was flanked by neat stacks of split wood, a collection of cooking utensils hanging within easy reach, and a stone hearth extension Jamie had built to increase its heat retention. Above it hung a mantle made from a single piece of oak. On its surface were treasured items. The camera Henry had given him, now accompanied by several developed photographs, a small carved figure of a dog that looked unmistakably like Scout, and a smooth river stone with natural markings that looked like a smiling face. Light fixtures, simple oil lamps with strategically positioned reflectors, banished the gloom that had once made evenings a time of limited activity. A braided rug, Jamie's first attempt at weaving, added color to the floor. Curtains made from fabric he'd traded a season's worth of carvings for softened the windows. Outside, the cabin's transformation was just as remarkable. The porch had been rebuilt and extended to create a sheltered workspace for projects that required good light. A split-rail fence, more decorative than functional, defined the immediate yard. The garden had expanded to triple its original size and now included herbs and flowers among the vegetables. A small outbuilding served as both storage and a smokehouse. Rain barrels, connected by a clever gutter system, collected water from the roof. A stone path, laid piece by piece during spare moments, led from the porch to the garden, branching toward the outhouse, which now had a proper door and roof, and the tool shed Jamie had built from salvaged materials. Standing in the doorway, looking out over his domain, Jamie felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond pride. This wasn't just shelter anymore. Every board, every nail, every carefully crafted item represented a choice to build rather than just endure, to create beauty along with function, and to establish permanence in a world that had once been defined by loss. "We did good," he told Scout, who had gotten up to join him at the threshold. The dog leaned against the boy's leg, his muzzle now dusted with gray, but his eyes still bright with devotion. Together, they had transformed not just a cabin, but a life. The crutch was a rough thing, made quickly from a forked branch with a padded crosspiece tied to the top with strips of cloth. It wobbled a little under Jamie's weight as he struggled from the bed to the table, its uneven surface catching on the smooth floorboards. "Need to sand it better," Jamie muttered through gritted teeth. The pain in his leg flared up with each movement. Scout hovered nearby, anxious, his usual playful energy dampened by his master's obvious pain. For days had passed since the fall. Jamie had been harvesting cedar boughs from a standing dead tree, planning to use the fragrant branches to stuff a new mattress. He'd climbed higher than usual, reaching for a particularly full section, when the brittle wood had given way beneath him. The fall had been quick, maybe 15 feet, but the landing had been unforgiving. His right leg had taken impact at an awkward angle, and the sharp crack had been audible even over his startled cry. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of agony and determination. He dragged himself through underbrush and over uneven ground, using fallen branches as makeshift crutches, collapsing often as the pain overwhelmed him. Scout had stayed close, whining with concern now and then, but seemed to understand the need to stay calm. That first night had been the worst. Unable to reach his carefully organized medical supplies on the high shelf, Jamie had lain on the cabin floor, where he'd finally managed to crawl, going back and forth between waves of pain and periods of lightheaded detachment. Scout had pressed against him, providing warmth as he went into shock. By morning, Jamie had gotten enough strength to assess his injury. The leg wasn't obviously deformed, which gave him some hope that the bone wasn't severely broken. Massive swelling and deep bruises painted a picture of injury from knee to ankle. Any attempt to put weight on it sent sharp pains through his entire body. Now, on the fourth day, Jamie faced the reality of his situation with growing worry. The pain had settled into a dull throbbing when he was still, but sharpened to a knife-like intensity when he moved. The swelling had gone down a little, revealing more extensive bruising. But what worried him most was how helpless he was becoming. His water supplies, carefully stored in covered buckets, would last maybe another day. Firewood, which he usually stacked within easy reach of the stove, had dwindled to just a few pieces. Food was the most pressing problem. The pantry had staples, but fresh food needed to be harvested from the garden, which was now impossible without help. "Scout," Jamie called softly, patting the bed beside him. The dog jumped up, careful to avoid the injured leg. "We've got problems, boy." Scout tilted his head, his ears perked up attentively. "I need to figure this out." Jamie went over his options in his mind, each one more unlikely than the last. The nearest neighbor, Cal Erickson, lived miles away over rough terrain, which was impossible to reach in his current condition. Mason's store was even farther. No one would miss him. His trading visits weren't regular, enough to alert anyone to his absence. For the first time since they'd arrived at the cabin, Jamie faced the possibility that the independence he'd worked so hard for might be fatal. The mountain that had sheltered them now isolated them when they needed help the most. A scratching at the door interrupted his increasingly dark thoughts. Scout's ears perked forward, his posture alert but not alarmed. Jamie instinctively reached for the rifle propped near the bed before recognizing the rhythm of the sound. It wasn't a bear or other predator, but Scout's own paw, asking to come in. His confusion lasted only a moment before he understood. It wasn't Scout beside him, but Scout at the door. Looking down at the bed, Jamie realized that his mind, clouded with pain and worry, had created the companion he relied on. "Come," he called weakly. The door, which he'd left unlatched for this reason, swung open as Scout nudged it with his nose. In his mouth, the dog carried a rabbit, freshly killed and still warm. Jamie's throat tightened with emotion. "Good boy," he whispered as Scout dropped the rabbit at his feet, offering on the floor beside the bed. "Smart. Good boy." Over the following days, a new partnership developed between them. Scout, who was always smart, now seemed to understand how serious their situation was with a surprising awareness. He retrieved things Jamie pointed to, dragging heavier objects across the floor with determined strength. He learned to pull the water bucket from under the rain barrel spigot, carefully carrying the full container back to the cabin. Most impressively, he kept hunting, bringing small game directly to Jamie's bedside with obvious pride. Jamie made better crutches as his strength slowly returned, allowing him to make short trips around the cabin. He created a system of ropes and pulleys that allowed him to get things from the high shelves without standing. Each small victory over his limitations brought equal parts relief and frustration at the tasks that were still out of reach. Nights were the hardest. The pain often got worse in the dark. Along with the fears, he kept at bay during the day. What if the bone wasn't healing properly? What if he got an infection? What if permanent damage left him crippled in this isolated place? Scout seemed to sense these darker moments, pressing closer, offering warmth and silent companionship until he finally fell asleep. Weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Jamie tracked his recovery. Through careful measurements and notes, using knowledge he'd gotten from medical books he'd traded for a mason store. The swelling went down completely. The bruises faded through their range of purples and yellows before disappearing. He could put weight on it for short periods, but the deep ache remained. "We're getting there," Jamie told Scout one morning as he took his first unassisted step in nearly a month. The dog watched this milestone with obvious approval, his tail sweeping the floor in gentle acknowledgement. The injury had revealed weaknesses in their mountain life that Jamie had never fully considered. It had also revealed strengths he didn't know they had. Scout's remarkable adaptability, his own stubborn resilience, and their combined ability to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The crutch, which had initially been a symbol of limitation, had changed in Jamie's mind to represent something else entirely. The ingenuity that comes from need. The tools made from what life provides instead of what he wished for, exactly what he and Scout had been doing all along. The observation post wasn't much to look at, just a small platform wedged between three pines on a ridge overlooking the main path to the cabin. Jamie had built it during his recovery, when he could take short trips, but not longer hikes. He'd reinforced the natural formation with salvage boards, added a simple roof of overlapping branches, and camouflaged the whole thing with pine boughs. From this vantage point, he could see almost a quarter of a mile down the valley while staying practically invisible to anyone below. It had started as a hunting blind, but had become something more, a security measure, a quiet retreat, and today, an essential lookout. Jamie lay flat on the platform, the old binoculars he'd traded for steady in his hands. Scout crouched beside him, unusually still, as if he understood the need for complete silence. Below, moving steadily along the creek that led to their cabin, were four figures in uniform. The first sign of trouble had come at dawn. Scout's alert posture at the cabin door, his ears forward, and a low rumble in his throat. Jamie had hushed him immediately, straining to hear what had triggered the warning. Distant voices carried on the morning air, too faint to make out the words, but definitely human. Several humans moving with purpose through their once private domain. Years of caution had created habits that were hard to break. Within minutes, Jamie had put the emergency plan he developed but never expected to use into action. Scout's training was activated with a single hand signal, silent mode, no barking under any circumstances. Essential documents and irreplaceable items went into the waterproof pack, which was always kept ready. Most importantly, the cabin underwent a quick transformation. Jamie moved methodically, taking down personal photographs, hiding Henry's camera and the developing kit he'd gotten after months of trading. The chess set and other distinctive crafts disappeared into a hidden storage space under the repaired floorboards. He quickly took apart the small desk where he kept journals and educational materials, stacking the pieces to look like ordinary firewood. The goal wasn't to hide that someone lived there. That would be impossible. It was to hide how long they'd been living there and how permanent it was. A temporary hunter's camp might not attract much attention, but a miner living alone would trigger an immediate response. Now, watching the search party approach through the binoculars, Jamie analyzed their movements with a heightened awareness of prey watching predators. Their uniforms had patches he couldn't quite make out from that distance. Not military, something else, maybe Forest Service or park rangers. They moved with the methodical precision of people doing a grid search, pausing now and then to mark locations on maps or check handheld devices, looking for someone. Someone, Jamie whispered to Scout, whose ears twitched at the sound. Not us. Specifically, someone else. He felt relief mixed with continued caution. A general search meant they weren't the target, but being discovered would still have consequences. He'd be asked questions he couldn't easily answer. His age, now 15 but small for his age, would raise immediate concerns. The absence of adults would trigger responses that Jamie had carefully avoided for 4 years. The search party got closer. Through the binoculars, Jamie could now see details. Radios clipped to their belts, the insignia of the State Forestry Department, and the tire determination in there. Movements. They stopped at the stream, crossing just half a mile from the cabin, one of them kneeling to examine something on the ground. Jamie's heart skipped a beat. Had he left tracks during yesterday's fishing trip? No, he'd been careful as always, sticking to rocks and hard ground. Still, these were professionals, trained to notice small changes in the natural environment that casual observers would miss. After a quick discussion, the group changed course slightly, heading west, away from the cabin. Jamie let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Scout remained still. Beside him, his dark eyes tracking the retreating figures. They stayed at their observation post until sunset, watching as the search party made camp in a clearing 2 ridges away. The pinpoint of their campfire glowed orange against the darkening blue of the evening. "We should check the cabin," Jamie whispered, even though there was no one to hear them now. Scout's tail wagged once in acknowledgement, the only movement he'd made in hours. The return journey through the gathering darkness required all their woodland skills. Jamie moved silently along paths he'd memorized, avoiding dry branches and loose stones that might give them away. Scout moved like a shadow beside him, a shadow among shadows. The cabin seemed undisturbed, exactly as they'd left it that morning. Still, Jamie approached cautiously, circling the whole structure before daring to go inside. Inside, he lit a single candle, keeping it away from the windows where its light could be seen from a distance. "We're okay for now," he told Scout, who finally relaxed his watchful posture and settled near the cold wood stove. "But they'll be back tomorrow." He slept restlessly that night, waking up often to check the ridge where the search party's campfire had slowly died down to embers. Jamie's mind raced with contingency plans. If they came directly to the cabin, he and Scout would run to the emergency shelter he'd set up in a cave system a mile north. If they used aerial search, he'd seen helicopters used in mountain rescues before, they'd need deeper cover than the forest. Canopy could provide. By dawn, the search had started again, but the team continued westward, their voices fading into the distance. For 3 days, Jamie stayed constantly on guard, tracking their movements from different observation points he'd established throughout his territory. Scout seemed to understand how serious their situation was, obeying silent commands with perfect precision, his natural instincts for stealth proving invaluable. On the 4th day, the search party left the area completely, leaving behind only trampled vegetation and a few biodegradable marker flags that would disappear in the next heavy rain. "They've given up," Jamie said. The tension of the past few days finally eased from his shoulders as he and Scout watched from their observation post. Either they'd given up or they'd found who they were looking for. Either way, the immediate threat was gone, but its impact remained. Their mountain sanctuary, which had seemed so far from the troubles of the outside world, had turned out to be more fragile than Jamie had allowed himself to believe. That night, by candlelight, he added to the emergency plan, making more caches of essential supplies hidden in strategic locations and memorizing multiple escape routes. Scout was trained to respond to new signals that would guide them to safety if words became too dangerous. The mountain was still their home, but now its borders seemed more open, its protection less absolute. The smoke appeared as a smudge on the horizon, easy to dismiss as a distant cloud if it weren't for its distinctive color, gray, tinged with yellow, rising but not billowing, holding its shape against the otherwise clear blue. Jamie noticed it first from the garden. He straightened up from his work, shielding his eyes from the glare of the afternoon sun. Scout, sensing Jamie's sudden stillness, looked up from his napping spot in the shade. "Fire," Jamie stated. The single word carried the weight of generations of mountain dwellers who intrinsically understood its grave implications. This wasn't a controlled burn for a campfire or clearing brush. This was a wildfire, unpredictable, all-consuming, and completely indifferent to anything that stood in its path. By evening, the distant smudge had morphed into a distinct column, its base spreading out along the western ridge. The air carried a faint, acrid taste, and particles of ash occasionally drifted down like some macabre snow. Jamie spent the twilight hours on his observation platform, using binoculars to track the fire's progress, calculating its distance and direction with growing concern. "Too close," he told Scout as they headed back to the cabin. "The winds are pushing it this way." The mountain had imparted many lessons to Jamie during his 5 years of residence, but none more profoundly than the importance of preparedness. The emergency supplies were already packed and ready to go, a habit he'd maintained ever since the search party incident months before. Water barrels were filled to capacity. The root cellar held enough preserved food to last for weeks, but fire posed a threat that couldn't be waited out or evaded by simply relocating. Morning confirmed his worst fears. Overnight, the smoke had thickened, obscuring the sun and casting an eerie orange light across the landscape. The distant crackle of flames filled the air, occasionally punctuated by the sharp report of exploding trees as their sap reached the boiling point. Jamie worked with methodical urgency, Scout never straying far from his side. He scaled the roof, carefully removing any accumulated debris from the gutters and shingles, and then thoroughly soaked the wooden shakes with water. From buckets, he hauled up his homemade ladder. Next, he focused on the perimeter, moving wood piles and other flammable materials away from the cabin's exterior, clearing a wider space between the structure and the forest than his aesthetic preferences had previously allowed. Most critically, he tackled the fire break, using tools he'd accumulated over the years through trading and salvage. Jamie began clearing a defensible zone around his home. The shovel bit into the earth, exposing the mineral soil that would resist embers. The rake dragged away leaves and pine needles that could carry ground fire. The axe and saw removed lower branches from nearby trees, eliminating the latter fuels that could carry the flames into the canopy. Hour after hour, he expanded the cleared area, working outward from the cabin in concentric circles. His hands blistered, then bled, then went numb. His lungs burned from the exertion and the increasingly smoky air. Scout assisted as best he could, dragging smaller branches away from the clearing and staying close whenever Jamie's exhaustion required brief rest. By nightfall, the western sky glowed with an unnatural brightness. The fire had crested the nearest ridge. It was still miles away, but advancing with frightening speed through the drought-stressed forest. Occasional tongues of flame shot skyward as particularly resinous trees ignited, now visible even without binoculars. "We should go," Jamie admitted, surveying their preparations with the critical eye of someone whose life depended on their adequacy. The firebreak looked pitifully inadequate against the approaching inferno, like a child's sandcastle before an incoming tide. Scout whined softly, pressing against Jamie's leg as if sensing his uncertainty. "But this is home," Jamie continued, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Everything we've built, everything we've become." The decision solidified not as a conscious choice, but as a bone-deep certainty. They would stay. They would defend. They might fail, but they would not abandon without a fight. Throughout the night, Jamie maintained vigilance, catching moments of restless sleep between hourly perimeter checks. He prepared as best he could, filling every container with water, soaking burlap sacks for smothering stray embers, and positioning tools for quick access. Scout remained uncharacteristically close, foregoing his usual nocturnal explorations to stay within arm's reach. Dawn brought no relief. The sun was a dim, red disk barely visible through smoke that had thickened into a suffocating blanket. Ash fell steadily now, accumulating on surfaces like gray snow. The fire's roar had grown audible, even between gusts of wind, a deep, hungry sound unlike anything else in nature. By mid-morning, falling embers began landing within their clearing, carried miles ahead of the main fire front by powerful convection currents. Jamie patrolled constantly, stamping out nascent flames, sweeping hot ash from the roof, and wetting down areas that seemed particularly vulnerable. Scout had taken to carrying one of the soaked burlap sacks, dropping it at smoldering spots with an uncanny awareness of where it was needed. The day dissolved into a blur of smoke, sweat, and desperate activity. Jamie lost track of time, measuring progress only in small victories. This ember extinguished, that Spot defended, another hour survived. His world narrowed to his immediate surroundings. All thought of past or future was subsumed by the urgent now. Evening brought the fire front itself, advancing through the forest with apocalyptic intensity. Trees became torches, then skeletons, then ash. The heat pressed against Jamie's face like a physical force, even from hundreds of yards away. The sound was overwhelming, not just the roar of flames, but the chorus of destruction that accompanied it. Trees splitting, roots tearing from the earth, occasional wildlife fleeing with panicked cries. Throughout the longest night of their mountain life, Jamie and Scout fought together to protect their home. When spot fires ignited the garden, they smothered them with wet sacks. When embers collected against the cabin wall, they swept them away before they could ignite the wood. When a burning branch fell onto the roof, Jamie climbed up through heat and smoke to push it away, the skin blistering on contact. Near dawn, when exhaustion threatened to overcome determination, the wind shifted, a subtle change at first, then more pronounced. The main fire front, having consumed the available fuel to their west, began moving northward, and the cabin was no longer in its direct path. By morning, the immediate danger had passed. The landscape around them had been transformed. Blackened trees stood like sentinels across much of their view. The understory was reduced to ash, but their clearing remained a green island in a charred sea. The cabin was singed, but intact. Jamie sank to the porch steps, Scout collapsing beside him with equal exhaustion. Together they surveyed what had been saved and what had been lost. The garden was partially burned, and the outlying structures were damaged. The forest they had known was fundamentally altered, but they remained. Their home remained. "We did it, boy," Jamie whispered, his voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. Scout's tail thumped once against the porch boards in weary acknowledgement. The firebreak, that desperate last defense, had made the difference between devastation and survival. The book lay open on the table, its pages dog-eared and annotated in Jamie's increasingly neat handwriting. Unlike the adventure novels and wilderness guides that comprised most of his small library, this volume dealt with civic matters, specifically the legal status of minors in their state. Jamie had traded 4 intricately carved boxes for it at Mason's, earning a raised eyebrow from the old storekeeper, but no questions. Emancipation, Jamie read aloud to Scout, who listened with customary attention from his place by the wood stove. Legal recognition of a minor's capacity to act as an adult. His finger traced beneath the words as he read, a habit formed during years of self-education. 6 years had passed since their arrival at the cabin. Jamie's 16th birthday had come and gone, with little ceremony beyond a special meal and a new collar for Scout crafted from supple leather traded from a trapper. The dog, now showing distinct gray around his muzzle and eyes, remained Jamie's constant companion, though his movements had slowed and his hunting expeditions had grown shorter. The isolation that had once represented safety now carried limitations Jamie could no longer ignore. His knowledge, cobbled together from books and occasional conversations, contained significant gaps. His health, while generally good, lacked professional oversight. Most critically, his existence remained unofficial. No documentation, no legal standing, no protection beyond what the mountain and his own ingenuity provided. The wildfire had forced a reckoning. As Jamie rebuilt the damaged structures and replanted the garden, a parallel process of internal reconstruction had begun. The fragility of their mountain life had been exposed by flames that nearly consumed everything. What other threats might arise that couldn't be addressed through self-reliance alone? "We need options," Jamie told Scout, closing the book and reaching for the notebook where he'd been documenting his research. Pages of careful notes outlined the legal pathway toward emancipation, the process whereby a minor could be legally recognized as self-sufficient, granted the rights and responsibilities of adulthood before reaching the age of majority. The requirements seemed specifically designed to exclude someone in Jamie's situation: documented income source, established residence, educational assessment. Yet each obstacle had prompted not defeat but strategic planning. Over the months, he had built a case that might withstand official scrutiny. Mason's trading post provided the foundation. Jamie's crafts, once simple trade goods, had evolved into sought-after items purchased by tourists and collectors. At Jamie's request, Mason had begun keeping rudimentary sales records, documenting a modest but consistent income stream. Alongside these, Jamie maintained his own meticulous accounts, tracking expenses and earnings with a precision that would have impressed professional bookkeepers. Education presented a different challenge. Having left formal schooling after the 4th grade, Jamie's knowledge contained unusual combinations of sophistication and gaps. Wilderness skills and practical mathematics existed, alongside limited understanding of history and formal grammar. To address this, he'd established a rigorous self-study program using textbooks obtained through trade and occasional purchases. The shelves in the cabin currently held volumes ranging from basic algebra to American government, each worked through systematically and documented in notebooks. The residence requirements seemed simplest on the surface. He had certainly established a permanent dwelling. Yet proving occupancy without revealing his unauthorized beginnings required careful consideration. Jamie had begun establishing a documented timeline through receipts from Masons, dated photographs developed at a shop in the nearest town, and relationships with neighboring homesteaders who could, if necessary, testify to his presence and self-sufficiency. The most difficult decision had been determining his approach to his personal history. Complete honesty about his abandonment and years alone might trigger interventions he wished to avoid. Yet fabrication would undermine his case and possibly constitute fraud. Jamie had settled on a carefully constructed narrative that acknowledged his unusual circumstances while emphasizing his current capabilities rather than past vulnerabilities. Now, after months of preparation, the time for action had arrived. Jamie gathered the documents he'd assembled: identification papers recreated from memory, letters from mountain residents attesting to his character and capabilities, financial records, and educational self-assessments. These, along with a formally worded petition for emancipation, went into a leather portfolio crafted specifically for this purpose. Tomorrow, Jamie told Scout, who thumped his tail in acknowledgement. Without raising his head from his paws, we'll go to town. The county seat lay 30 miles distant, a journey they'd never attempted. Jamie had mapped the route carefully, calculating necessary rest periods for Scout, whose aging joints couldn't manage the entire distance in a single day. They would travel light, carrying only essentials and the precious documents representing their bid for legitimate existence. That evening, Jamie stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the recovering forest in gold. Blackened trunks stood in stark contrast to vibrant new growth emerging from the ash-enriched soil. The mountain was rebuilding itself after the fire, finding new forms of beauty amid the devastation. "Maybe we can do the same," Jamie whispered. Inside, he completed final preparations. His clothes, his best, though still handmade or traded for, were laid out for the morning. Food for the journey waited in a small pack. The cabin was secured against his first multi-day absence. Perishables were stored appropriately, and fire hazards were eliminated. Sleep came fitfully, anxiety and anticipation taking turns at wakeful moments. Scout seemed to sense his tension, pressing closer than usual against Jamie's side, offering wordless reassurance. Dorn found them already on the trail, moving with purpose through a forest still beautiful despite its transformation. Jamie carried the portfolio close against his body, protected from the weather and brush. Each step took them further from isolation and closer to a world of structure, rules, and human complexity, largely forgotten during their years of self-imposed exile. Yet, it wasn't fear that drove Jamie forward, but something more nuanced, a recognition that true independence came not from isolation, but from engagement on one's own terms. The mountain had given him strength, skills, and identity. Now, it was time to carry those gifts beyond its boundaries. Whatever happens, Jamie told Scout as they paused at a ridge overlooking the distant civilization, we face it together. The deed felt heavier than its single page should allow, its official seal and formal language transforming a simple document into something profound. Jamie carefully placed it on the cabin table, smoothing its creases with reverent fingers. Scout watched from his customary place by the wood stove, his gray muzzle resting on paws that twitched occasionally in canine dreams. It's ours now, Jamie said softly. Legally ours. The journey to legitimacy had proven neither simple nor straightforward. The county officials had greeted Jamie's petition for emancipation with initial skepticism that bordered on dismissal. His carefully prepared documentation had earned reluctant review rather than immediate acceptance. Questions followed, probing, occasionally accusatory, designed to uncover inconsistencies in his narrative. Jamie had maintained his composure throughout, answering directly when possible, thoughtfully when necessary. Yes, he had been on his own for years. No, he did not wish to discuss the circumstances of his abandonment. Yes, he had established a sustainable income. No, he had not attended formal school, but could demonstrate educational competency. Scout had proven unexpectedly valuable during the process. His disciplined behavior and obvious bond. Jamie noticed the offering Scout had laid out beside the bed. That's my boy, good thinking. Over the next few days, a strong bond of partnership was forged between them. Scout, always a smart dog, now seemed to grasp the gravity of their situation with a remarkable sense of awareness. He'd fetch items Jamie pointed at, even straining to drag heavier things across the wooden floor, his muscles bunching with each determined effort. He figured out how to maneuver the water bucket out from under the rain barrel spout, carefully hauling the filled container back to the cabin, without spilling a drop. But the most amazing thing was that he kept up his hunting, bringing small game right to Jamie's bedside with obvious pride gleaming in his eyes. As his strength gradually returned, Jamie was able to improve his crutches, which allowed him to hobble around the cabin a little. He rigged up a system of ropes and pulleys that let him reach things on the high shelves, without having to stand up at all. Every little victory he scored against his physical limits was met with both relief and a simmering frustration at all the things he still couldn't do. Nights were always the toughest. The pain seemed to crank up after dark, and the fears he managed to suppress during the day would start creeping back in. What if the bone wasn't healing right? What if he developed a nasty infection? What if the injury resulted in permanent damage, leaving him hobbled in this remote wilderness? Scout seemed to pick up on those dark moods, snuggling closer, and offering silent, warm companionship until sleep finally claimed him. Weeks crawled by, each one feeling like an eternity. Jamie meticulously monitored his recovery, taking measurements and jotting down notes, using knowledge he gleaned from medical books he'd bartered for at Mason's general store. The swelling gradually subsided completely. The bruises faded away, cycling through a rainbow of purples and yellows before finally disappearing altogether. He could put some weight on a leg for short bursts, but that deep, throbbing ache just wouldn't go away. We're getting there, boy, Jamie reassured Scout one morning as he took his first step without the crutches in almost a month. The dog watched him reach this milestone with obvious approval, his tail swishing back and forth on the floor in gentle acknowledgement. The injury had shone a light on weaknesses in their mountain existence that Jamie hadn't fully considered before, but it had also brought into focus strengths he hadn't realized they possessed. Scout's incredible ability to adapt, Jamie's own stubborn refusal to give in, and their combined resourcefulness in overcoming what seemed like impossible challenges. The crutch, once a stark reminder of his limitations, had transformed in Jamie's mind. Now it represented something entirely different, the sheer ingenuity that springs from necessity, making tools out of whatever life throws your way instead of pining for what you wish you had, which was pretty much how he and Scout had been living all along. The observation post wasn't much to look at, just a little platform nestled among 3 pine trees on a ridge that overlooked the main trail to the cabin. Jamie had constructed it during his recovery when he could. Handle short jaunts, but not long hikes. He'd reinforced the natural structure with salvage boards, added a simple roof of overlapping branches, and camouflaged the whole thing with pine boughs. From that vantage point, he could keep an eye on almost a quarter-mile of the valley below, while remaining practically invisible to anyone down there. It had started out as just a hunting blind, but it had become so much more: a security measure, a quiet place to escape to, and now a crucial lookout post. Jamie lay flat on the platform, the old binoculars he'd gotten in a trade held steadily in his hands. Scout was crouched beside him, unusually quiet, as if he understood the need for absolute silence. Down below, for figures in uniform were moving purposefully along the creek that led directly to their cabin. The first sign of trouble had been at dawn. Scout's rigid stance at the cabin door, his ears pricked forward, and a low, guttural growl rumbling in his throat. Jamie had immediately shushed him, straining to hear what had set him off. Faint voices drifted through the morning air, too distant to make out the words, but definitely human. Several humans, moving with purpose through what they'd always considered their private sanctuary. Years of living cautiously had become ingrained habits. Within minutes, Jamie had put his emergency plan, which he'd developed but never thought he'd actually need, into motion. A single hand signal activated Scout's training, silent mode, which meant no barking no matter what. Essential documents and irreplaceable items went into the waterproof pack, which was always kept ready to go. Most importantly, the cabin underwent a rapid transformation. Jamie moved quickly and efficiently, taking down personal photos, hiding Henry's camera, and the developing kit he'd acquired after months of bartering. The chess set and other unique handcrafted items vanished into a secret compartment, hidden beneath the repaired floorboards. He quickly disassembled the small desk where he kept his journals and learning materials, stacking the pieces to look like ordinary firewood. The goal wasn't to pretend that nobody lived there. That would be impossible. It was to hide how long they'd been living there and how permanent it was. A temporary hunter's camp might not raise any eyebrows, but a miner living alone would trigger a whole lot of unwanted attention. Now, watching the search party closing in through his binoculars, Jamie analyzed their movements with the heightened awareness of prey watching predators. Their uniforms had patches he couldn't quite make out from that distance. Not military. Something else, maybe the Forest Service or park rangers. They moved with the deliberate precision of professionals doing a grid search, stopping now and then to mark locations on maps or check handheld GPS devices, looking for someone. Someone, Jamie whispered to Scout, whose ears twitched at the sound. Not necessarily us. Just someone. He felt a mix of relief and continued apprehension. A general search meant they weren't specifically the target, but getting discovered would still have consequences. He'd face questions he couldn't easily answer. His age, 15, but small for his age, would immediately raise concerns. The absence of any adults would trigger responses that Jamie had carefully avoided for the past 4 years. High up in the backwoods of the Appalachian Mountains, a forgotten region, an 11-year-old boy stands near a cabin that's definitely seen better days. His only friend is a mangy mutt with one torn-up ear. It's been 2 years since his mom left him at a gas station, handed him $20, and promised she'd be right back. Those 2 years have been spent drifting, struggling to survive, and finally finding this abandoned shack tucked away among giant, old pine trees and hidden in the morning fog. The cabin's roof is sagging like it's about to